Remembering Music, Side 1. Let's talk about music. Whether you are a musician, a music teacher, or a student, you know how hard it can be to remember music. In this course, you will learn new methods for remembering everything from notes to chords to music history. We'll start with the basics. How can a new student remember all the symbols we use in music? He has to be able to look at a page of music and recognize sharps, flats, bar lines, bass clef, treble clef, and time signatures, not to mention the notes themselves. For most of us learn everything by rote memorization. Our piano teacher drills us on the position of the notes, and every new bit of information has to be practically pounded into our heads. In this course, we will use the mnemonic methods taught in the supermemory course to learn new information. You'll be amazed at how easy it is to remember music. Let's start with a mnemonic device that almost every music student has used to learn the lines and spaces on the bass and treble staffs. Follow along in your workbook on page 2. The spaces on the bass staff are A, C, E, and G. Nothing could be easier to remember than the phrase, "All cows eat grass." All you have to remember is that the bottom space is A, and the phrase supplies the rest of the letters. We can remember the spaces on the treble staff by the word face. Again, if you can remember F, you can easily remember the A, C, and E. Now look at the lines. The lines on the bass staff are G, B, D, F, and A. Without a mnemonic phrase, they would be very difficult to remember, but we can remember them easily by saying, "Good boys do fine always." The lines in the treble staff are remembered by saying, "Every good boy does fine." You don't have to use these phrases. In fact, if you'll spend a few minutes making up your own mnemonic phrase, you will remember them even better. These old mnemonic devices are good, but they're not great. You still have to remember the bottom lines and spaces for each staff. What if you forgot that bottom space of the treble staff is an F? Without that key, you can't remember that the spaces spell the word face. A much better idea would be to remember all the lines and spaces from top to bottom, and to link your mnemonic phrase to the words space and line. Perhaps you can make up a phrase for all of the lines from top to bottom or from bottom to top. Starting at the bottom of the bass staff and working your way to the top of the treble staff, the spaces are A, C, E, G, F, A, C, and E. Now here's an idea. You're floating in outer space with your good friend playing poker. You have an ace and your good friend has an ace also. Now you can remember the word space to remind you that these are the notes in the spaces. Plus you have the phrase ace, good friend, ace. That's all the spaces on both the treble and bass staffs. Well, now it's your turn. Stop the tape and try to make up your own phrase for all the lines on both staffs, starting at the bottom of the bass staff and working your way up to the top of the treble staff. Stop the tape now. If you did the exercise, you might have come up with a phrase such as, "Great big dogs fly and every good boy drives Ferraris." Now associate your phrase with the word line to remember that these are the notes on the lines. Let's look next at sharps and flats. Look at the symbols on page 3. The sharp is well named, isn't it? No matter where you touch it, you get poked. It's bristling with sharp points, and you can remember that it means to go up a half step by imagining yourself getting stabbed by the sharp. Your wound swells up. The flat may be harder to remember. It looks a lot like a lowercase b, but someone stepped on the b, it is flattened. And of course, when something is flat, it goes down. So a flat means to go down a half step. You can also remember the functions of the sharp and flat by using an initial letter mnemonic. You step on a sharp and fall on a flat. The natural is the third symbol. It seems to be a combination of the sharp and the flat, so it will cancel out sharps and flats. The letters used to indicate how soft or loud music should be played are P and F. P stands for soft and F for loud. The more P's, the softer the music gets, and the more F's, the louder. This is relatively easy to remember, but for the beginning student it can be confusing. We recommend the images of a powder puff for P and a firecracker for F. Firecrackers are certainly loud and powder puffs are very quiet. MF means mezzo forte and MP means mezzo piano. But for a beginning student, it's better to remember them as medium loud and medium soft. SFZ stands for sforzando. But what 7-year-old piano student wants to remember that? Better to simply remember that Z means zap. Sforzando means to place a strong accent on one note or chord. Beethoven loved the sforzando and would often use it on one chord right in the middle of a quiet passage to surprise the listener. You can use mnemonics to remember the words crescendo and diminuendo. A crescendo is used to gradually get louder, while a diminuendo is used to gradually get softer. By using the word crush for crescendo and dim for diminuendo, we can remember them easily. During a crescendo, the music gets so loud it's crushing. A diminuendo, on the other hand, is like turning down or dimming the music. Picture the music having a dimmer switch. Not only is this a good visual image, but the words dim and diminuendo come from the same roots. Let's talk next about the time signature. Beginning students are always confused by the time signature. What in the world does 4/4 mean, let alone 9/8? We need visual images, don't we? How about a basket of eggs? It's a perfect image because we use the terms measure and beat, which sound like we're cooking. We'll imagine we're cooking an omelet. The top number is the number of eggs we will use in each measure. Each egg gets 1 beat. So if the time signature is 6/8, there will be 6 beats in each measure. To an experienced musician, this is obvious, but to a young student, the phrase 6 beats to a measure can be hopelessly confusing. The bottom number tells you what kind of note will get 1 beat. Continuing our visualization, this number tells you what kind of eggs we're talking about. Are they giant ostrich eggs or tiny hummingbird eggs? We put the number 1 over the bottom number to create a fraction. If the bottom number is an 8, then the fraction is, of course, 1/8. If the bottom number is 4, the fraction is 1/4. This is the note that gets 1 beat, the 8th note, the quarter note, and so on. Now we'll put it all together. If the time signature is 6/8, we know that there will be 6 eggs or beats in each measure, and that 1/8 note gets 1 beat. The image of eggs helps the young students visualize. Speaking of quarter notes and 8th notes, it's very easy to apply mnemonic techniques for remembering the time value and name of each type of note. Look at the notes on page 5 in your workbook. The whole note looks like a donut with a hole in it. The half note is a note that's only half there. It looks like a note that was hollowed out. The quarter note is your standard black note with a stem. You can remember it by thinking of the stem as a chord. Or perhaps you can imagine buying notes and paying a quarter for the quarter notes. The 8th note has a tail. Imagine the note eating a rat with the rat's tail hanging out of its mouth. Now that's visual. You look at the note and remember that it ate a rat, so it must be an 8 note. Anyone old enough to understand fractions will be able to understand the relationship of each note to the others. Obviously, a half note will be held half as long as a whole note. If the student is confused, you can use a diagram of a pie cutting it into pieces. You can also use mnemonics to remember the order of sharps and flats. Look at the list on page 6 in your workbook. Using a simple initial letter mnemonic, we can remember the order of sharps by learning the phrase, "Families can give dogs an exciting bath." The silly sentence, "Boiled eggs and dead gorillas can fly," helps you remember the order of flats. As we've said before, you will remember even better if you spend a few minutes making up your own phrase. This is the end of side 1. Turn the tape over now, and we'll learn how to remember notes, chords, and other aspects of music theory. Remembering Music, Side 2. Let's delve now into something more complex, music theory. Even if you are an accomplished musician, you may find some aspects of music theory confusing. Scales, modes, major and minor, intervals, chords, These are only a few of the many things you have to learn. We can use the supermemory tools to remember all of them. Let's start with scales. We could come up with mnemonic devices to remember major, minor, chromatic, whole tone, blues, and other scales. But in this course, we will concentrate on major scales only. You can apply the same techniques for remembering all scales. Any scale is nothing more than a path from a tone to the same tone an octave or more higher. Most scales go from a tone to the same tone 1 octave higher, but the whole tone scale covers 2 octaves. You could create your own scale by playing a random progression from middle C to the next higher C. Some scales use one set of tones going up and another going down. The tough part is remembering how to create a certain scale. For example, the major scale is made up of 2 whole steps, 1 half step, 3 whole steps, and then 1 more half step. You can start on any tone, and if you follow that order of whole steps and half steps, you would play a major scale. You can remember the major scale by looking at the shape of the letters on page 8 in your workbook. The first 2 capital W's are grouped, and so are the last 3. You can picture an army major lying on his side. The first W's are his head, and the last are his body. The lowercase h between them is his neck. This image will help you remember the groupings of whole steps, and the army major tells you it's a major scale. We've already talked about intervals. Whole steps and half steps are intervals, aren't they? An interval is simply the distance from one tone to another. A half step is the interval from any note to its closest neighbor, and a whole step is 2 half steps. These are relatively easy to remember, but what happens when you're trying to remember that you need to play a sixth followed by a minor third? You can use the peg system you learned in the supermemory course to remember intervals. Look at the list on page 10 in your workbook. You will see 7 pegs that we have arbitrarily assigned to intervals. You should use your own pegs, of course, and if you have pegs that work better, then by all means use them. How could you use the pegs to remember music? Well, let's suppose you're trying to memorize a piece of music and you always get stuck at a certain point. Why not look at the interval, either between notes in a chord or from one note to the next? If you can see that you need to remember a sixth followed by a fifth, you can imagine yourself using a stick to knock a star out of the sky. If you're trying to remember a third, a fourth, and then an octave, you can picture yourself sitting on a tricycle and finding a quarter on the seat. You throw the quarter at an octopus to scare it away. Using these simple images will help you through the passages that seemed impossible to remember. While we're talking about intervals, let's discuss major, minor, augmented, and diminished. Although we will talk about these terms in more details later on this tape, you can remember each of them with another peg. Assign some object or some descriptive word to each term. For major, you can make the object very large. For minor, you can make it very small. We use diamonds to represent diminished and eggs to represent augmented. So if you need to remember a minor third, you can picture a very small tricycle. A major sixth might be a very large stick. A diminished seventh would be a diamond-studded 4-leaf clover, and an augmented fourth could be an omelet filled with quarters. You wouldn't want to use this method to remember Chopin's entire prelude in E minor, but it will help tremendously when you can remember how to get from one well-remembered section to the next. Now let's learn chords. There are millions of chords you can construct, but we will stick to the major, minor, augmented, and diminished chords. You can use the same techniques we will be discussing for remembering any chord. Look in your workbook on page 12. The 4 types of chords are listed. You can see that each chord is made up of 2 thirds. The major chord is made up of a major third and a minor third. The minor chord is a minor third and a major third. The augmented chord is made up of 2 major thirds, and the diminished chord is 2 minor thirds. That's a lot to remember, but we can use images to help. Imagine a giant gold miner in an army uniform. He's a major miner, isn't he? He represents the major chord. Now picture a tiny army major. He's a minor major, and he represents the minor chord. You can link his picture to the minor chord either by thinking of him as very young, to remind you of the word minor, or by imagining him singing a sad song in a minor key. Now think of a very large Army major named Augie. The large major reminds you of a major major, and the name reminds you of an augmented chord. Our last chord image is a tiny miner, digging for diamonds in a tiny mine. He's a minor miner, and the diamonds remind you that he represents the diminished chord. Now look at page 13, at the progression of chords built on the tones of the major scale. These are the chords most commonly used in pieces written in a major key. If you are a piano student, or if you have improvisational skills, you should be familiar with these chords. Guitar players will recognize the numbering system used to indicate the chord progression in a piece of music. We can use the supermemory system to remember chord progressions. If the progression in a particular piece of music is 1, 1, 4, 5, 1, you can certainly remember it using the peg system. Simply assign a peg to each number and then link the items together. If you're using the vowel peg system, you can remember 1, 1, 4, 5, and 1 by linking sun, sun, door, bike, and sun. Or you can use alternatives for sun, since 3 suns may be too much. Perhaps you can link gun, sun, door, bike, and slug. You use a gun to shoot the sun. The sun burns a hole in your front door. You pick up the door and ride away on a bike. Riding down the road, you run over a slug. On page 15, you will find a set of pegs you could use to remember chords by letter. In the progression 1, 1, 4, 5, 1, you need to link the pegs ape, ape, Dracula, elephant, and ape. 2 apes are walking through the forest. They see Dracula sucking the blood out of an elephant. The elephant steps on one of the apes. You can see how using these mnemonic techniques can help you remember music. You can use the same tools to remember chord progressions, notes, and musical facts. Be sure to read in your workbook, which also explains how to use the supermemory system to remember music history, modes, and all the Latin and Italian terms that are so difficult to remember.